One of the big questions I get when speaking about Jewish mysticism is really, I think, a very important question to address. And that is, where does Jewish mysticism come from? You know, and why do we call it Jewish mysticism? If these are mystical concepts that are true concepts about the essence of creation and of how the world works and the soul within mankind, then why don't we just call it mysticism? Why does it get that extra label, Jewish mysticism? And while we're on this point, let's ask further, what would be the difference between Jewish mysticism and some other type of mystic type of principle of thoughts that are out there? Is there other types of mysticism that we compete with? Is there Jewish mysticism competing against some other type of mysticism? Right. We cannot claim to be the only religion in the world that has access to mystical powers and mystical concepts, right? So let's address that. I think very, very fundamental and important to set the record straight. I'd like to start off with a very bold statement. I believe at the end of this discussion you will all agree that it is absolutely true as well as bold, is that there is no such thing as mysticism in the world other than Jewish mysticism. How does that sound? Did I sell you on it yet? So now's where the selling begins, and I think I might have upset anyone that's going to be watching this later on, you know, on the other platforms that it'll be displayed. They might take offense, but hear me out, hear this through, and you understand what I mean by that statement. Because if I can't back it up, then I'm just here, you know, we know more than a comedian. Except I'm not so funny. So let's get to the point. Where does all wisdom come from? We have to address that. That's part of this, because ultimately, mysticism is a part of divine wisdom. So where does all divine wisdom come from? So all divine wisdom comes from God. And when did this wisdom start to exist? Well, it always existed in God's head, so to speak. Discussing time and creation and God's eternality is a very deep concept. I want to just touch on it briefly. God, in his essence, is beyond wisdom, beyond creation, beyond time. However, when God chose to create, he chose to limit his divine expression, and he also chose to create a world where he would be able to connect. Though he is infinite, he would be able to connect with the finite beings that would take place in his world, that would live in his world. So this is an unbelievable thing. God, the infinite, takes notice of us and is interested in what we go through and decided to share of himself on some level with us. The greatest thing he shared with us is his wisdom. But he went further in sharing an opportunity for us to connect with that wisdom, and ultimately on the highest level with the divine will, with God's will. By living a life in accordance with what God desired this world to be like, what God ultimately had in mind when he created mankind and said, I would like to create human beings, and I would like them to live this type of life. If we can ascend and perceive what that type of life entails, what kind of behavior it is included in such a life, and what kind of behavior would be excluded, we would then be able to tap into what God initially wanted from us and this world that he created. So how do we find that out? Where do we get that priceless, eternal information that will transform our life from another level of existence of animal, the most sophisticated and of course handsome animals that exist, versus being angelic, being divine-like? As the verse in the Bible actually says that God created mankind in the divine image. How do we reach that divine image and move away from the animal that Hashem also created within us? So, thankfully so, God chose to give of this special knowledge of the essence and truth of creation and the purpose of the world and of mankind to very unique, special people. This begins with Adam, the first man, and it continues with righteous leaders throughout every and all generations. We'll start with the most famous of all of these righteous, special people, which if we learn about their life story, we would be blown away with how special they in fact were. One of the mistakes that we have as people is, especially in this generation, we think that everything comes to us and that we're great and we're all equal. And that's a fallacy. We are all created by God, and we all have self-worth that can only be measured by God. But we are not all the same, and we have not all been given the same role. A prophet of God is a person that reaches a spiritual level so exalted that it makes us seem like animals. And I will quote from the holy sages of the Talmud. The holy sages of the Talmud wanted to remind all of the generations that would come later how to understand their true place in the big picture. And they said this: if we want to consider a person like Moshe Rabbeinu like just another person, then we should consider ourselves like an animal, like a donkey. And not even a smart donkey, but a foolish donkey. But if we recognize that a person like Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, was a holy, saintly, godly man, more like an angel than a human being, then we can see ourselves as human beings. And that is something we must really take into consideration and remember always. A person like Moshe that wrote a book, also he wrote a book, like this author I mentioned earlier. I don't know what part of the video is going to be playing, but I mentioned that there was a nice man who wrote a book, My Conversation with God, so he can sell a lot of copies and make $1 million. He did not have a conversation with God. He had a nice conversation in his head with who knows, maybe he's schizophrenic, I don't know. But he did not have a conversation with God. You know who did have a conversation with God? Moses, the man of God. Moshe Rabbeinu had a conversation with God. And he wrote a book, not to make any money, not for any fame. He wrote a book called the Bible, the Torah. That's a person that sat and spoke to God face to face. Unbelievable. When you speak to God, then you can think that, the world revolves around you. But until then, realize we have our place in the big picture. And if we would accept our place, then nothing could be better than the place Hashem made for you, who you are in your generation. Yes, go ahead.
So, you seem very sure that whoever the author of that book was, he didn't talk to God. But you also seem very sure that Moshe Rabbeinu did talk to God. So how do you know?
Excellent. The question coming from the audience, there's a troublemaker over here, we're going to take care of him, don't worry about it, is I seem so certain that this man that wrote a book a few years ago, that he had a conversation with God, certainly did not, while at the same time I feel so certain that Moses did speak to God. Ultimately, many truths that we live with and base our life on, we cannot swear to 100%. We make the best educated guess we can, and we live with a level of faith and trust. For example, we trust smart people because we see that they know more than us, and we trust them for the things that are too complicated for us to figure out. I don't have to understand how a computer works in all its detail to benefit from a computer. Nor do I have to know how a plane flies before I can fly on a plane. I trust the people that designed the computers and the planes, that they were smarter than me and they figured out things that I can benefit from. I trust my parents, that they care about me and that they wouldn't willfully and knowingly lie to me. Now that does not leave room for the fact that they can be wrong. And unfortunately many parents are wrong about their life choices and path, and they pass that on to their children. So there are no real guarantees. However, we must look at the information before us and make the best educated guess on some level, and maybe a little bit of a leap of faith, and choose a life path that we feel is going to bring us somewhere positive. Now, one of the greatest benefits of choosing a life that is full with true value and morals and religious practice is that if you follow it the right way, especially, and I can speak mostly for Judaism, but it doesn't negate any other life paths for other people that were born of different religions, is you get a good life in this world. You get blessing, you get wholesomeness, you get truth, you get integrity, you get respect. Those are very important values to seek out and to try to live with and live for. So ultimately, again, I'm not talking about certain religious fanaticism and ritualism that may not have an immediate benefit. Right now, I'm specifically speaking about the clear benefit to living a life that's based on the Bible. Now, as far as believing that Moshe Rabbeinu was a true prophet, so there's a philosophical approach to answering that question. You cannot fake a public event. If there were 3 million people present when he claimed to be a prophet and were convinced that he was a prophet, he had good proof. They heard the voice of God. According to Scripture, they heard his voice, and it was such a high level of revelation that it was hard for them to make out 100% clear. But Moshe Rabbeinu then was able to fill in the blanks that were missing and prove to them that he was a true prophet. let's go one step further. All of the major religions of the world that we generally speak about, Catholicism, Christianity, the Muslim religion, and the Jewish religion, all accept as a fact that Moshe was a true prophet. It's funny, when they wanted to start their own religions, both the Christian religion and then the Muslim religion, they understood that it's going to be foolish to try to undermine the first true religion. And so they used the Jewish religion and its prophets as a base of validity for their own religion. And that itself is not a proof either. It's hard to bring absolute proofs, but it shows you that they understood and recognized and accepted the truth of the Jewish prophets. So we as Jews today, to come in and reject and think this is all a fallacy, and how could God choose one nation and leave the others out? Well, it has to start somewhere, and where it started was with the small nation of Israel, but it was meant for the entire world. One secret that not everybody is aware of is when God gave the Bible through Moses to the Jewish people on Mount Sinai, he gave the entire world the same Torah. Each nation of the world has a part in that Torah because it is a revelation of God's ultimate plan, and everyone in God's world has a purpose. As we started saying, all true wisdom comes from God. And so mysticism, if it's going to be true, has to come from God. So let's start with some of the more famous basic ideas that we know come from God. Again, many accept. We're not here to prove. That's not the philosophical point of this talk, is to prove how we know and how is the Torah that was given at Mount Sinai absolutely true. We are going to accept it on some level and accept that many people in the world, many religions in the world, accept it as a valid and true event. So let's start with the written words of the 5 books of Moses, which are accepted by a vast majority to be authentically the words of God that were given to Moses, the prophet of God. Okay, now here's where we're going to have to take a little bit of a step to this beyond that. Now, there is an oral tradition, an oral dialogue that took place between God and Moshe as well. And that oral dialogue is, so to speak, like the fills in all of the blanks in the written work of the Torah. Because let's take one example, and from that we can understand how the whole written Torah works together with an oral Torah. The mitzvah of putting on tefillin. The Torah itself is very, very concise, and it only mentions a few words about the tefillin that we're meant to wear. It's supposed to have certain parts of the Torah itself written and placed on our arm and on our head, and what they look like, what exact words should be in them, how they should be applied to the arm and head. All of that is left unmentioned. So the question is, how do we know exactly how to fulfill that mitzvah, that command of wearing tefillin? How do we know that they should be black boxes, they should be square, they should have parchments on the tefillin of the head? It should be 4 separate parchments. On the tefillin that go on the arm, it should be 1 parchment with the same 4 sections written, but on 1 page of parchment. So how do we know all this? So this is one of the indications, and one of the, in fact, proofs on some level that there was an oral interpretation and explanation that came from God to Moses. And so the oral Torah is no less part of the Torah, part of the divine command and divine expression of his wisdom than the written. And it goes together. Written and oral go together. Without the oral, you're missing the explanation and the application for the written. So that's the beginning of appreciating and understanding where Jewish mysticism comes from. Because the oral Torah, which again is going to be the detailed explanation of how to follow and fulfill all of what the Torah itself is asking of us, is the beginning of appreciating where Jewish mysticism comes from. So let's go one step further. In addition to the technical details that the oral Torah sheds a light on, for example, that the tefillin boxes have to be black, have to be square, have to have 4 separate sections written in a particular order, 4 parchments in the head and 1 parchment in the arm. The same place where that information comes from, and many of the other details in the Torah of how to fulfill the mitzvot, there is a deeper explanation that was also given over by God to Moses. Remember, they did not sit for 40 days and 40 nights having a conversation about basic external details. Ultimately, serving Hashem needs to have a spirit, needs to have a soul, it needs to have a heart, it needs to have deep understanding. And so within the conversation between God and Moshe was also a discussion of how these commands affect the realms that are just above this physical world. God did not just create a world. God created worlds. He created many worlds. Physical, spiritual, and many worlds. According to Kabbalah, there are many worlds that God created. There's in fact a very inspiring story about one of the great Jewish rabbis that lived in Russia during the time of communism and a lot of persecution. People were taken to Siberia for just practicing their religion. Putting on tefillin could have got you in Siberia. People were killed. The Russians then, the Tsar, he controlled Russia with an iron fist, and they killed people. People disappeared left and right. It was a crazy time. Today, it's hard to relate to what it was like living then. You can read some of the older stories, and it's insane. For example, I read the other day a story about a Jewish family that was renting a piece of property from a landlord, and they couldn't pay the rent after a year, and they put the entire family in prison and sentenced them all to death. There were crazier times than we see today. Trust me. And so just to appreciate, so this was the time when the Russian, the KGB decided that those Chabad rabbis and those Chabad that are trying to really pursue religion and defiantly teach Jewish religion have to be stopped. And they didn't stop at just taking some of the soldiers, so to speak, of the Rebbe. They took the actual Rebbe, the leader of the entire Chabad Lubavitch Jewish movement in Russia, and they took him prisoner. And they tortured him. They beat him. And at one point, he tells his whole story that the person pulled a gun to his head and said, "We're going to kill you. We're going to shoot you." And he answered like this: "Your gun may scare a person that believes in many gods and one world. But when you believe in one God and many worlds, then your gun doesn't scare me. It's like holding a toy." And he survived that confrontation, and he survived to come and move to America and build the beginning of a Jewish movement that is flourishing. Like wherever there's Coca-Cola, there's Chabad. Okay? So again, we believe in one God and many worlds, not many gods and one world. Fortunately, when you have many gods in one world, you run around like a pinball being bounced around, worshiping every little thing that tickles your fancy, and you get nowhere in life. We have a life, we have a purpose, we have prophets, and we have scholars that have bestowed upon us unbelievable wisdom, depth of wisdom that you could spend your entire life learning. So again, not to get too off topic, the mysticism, the true mysticism, what we call Kabbalah, was given to Moshe. And it's not that he was the first person to ever learn these secrets. These secrets were also taught to Adam and to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob, and to even, there were several holy people in between like Hanoch and Methuselah. There were very righteous holy people that learned the secrets of creation, the secrets of Kabbalah. It was kept private. At Mount Sinai, it was re-given over to Moshe in a complete way, more than anyone before him, and it was still kept private. Moshe gave over the written Torah to all of the Jewish people. He gave over the oral interpretation and explanation of how to fulfill the mitzvot on a basic level to all of the Jewish people. And he gave over the secrets of Kabbalah, which is called Jewish mysticism, which is really true mysticism. If it's true mysticism, it has to come from Moshe. It can't come from anywhere else. He gave that over only to a few select Jewish leaders. And that wisdom was given over from leader to student, which eventually were the leaders of the generations for over 2,000 years. It wasn't until the time of around the Common Era, when the Jews were being exiled, where permission was given to the great holy Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who considered the author of the Zohar, was given permission to finally record in writing the secrets of Torah. And now it's interesting. It was given permission to write it, and then it was hidden. The book was hidden for another 1,000, 1,500 years. Common Era, about 1,500 years. And then all of a sudden the book surfaced. Now here's an interesting thing that is, again, not going to be an absolute proof, but it's going to really give us some substantial basis for what I'm saying. There are ideas that are written in that Zohar that was hidden for 1,500 years that no one saw, that you can find spoken about in other holy works. Why? Because the books were hidden, but the teachings were passed on from rabbi to student throughout that 1,500 years. So a special rabbi like Maimonides, who was known to be one of the last true Kabbalists, one of the last true Jewish mystics until later on when the Arizal surfaced in Tzfat, he writes about ideas that he never saw in the physical Zohar because the Zohar was hidden, but that he learned from his Rebbe, who learned it from his teacher, and so on, back to Rabbi Shimon, all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu. So the true wisdom of the secrets of creation, of the real mystical realms that exist above us, the depth of the soul and of God, and of how all the mechanics of the upper worlds and how they work together as one big ultimate creation by God, all that wisdom was, again, given over to Adam, to Abraham, to the great leaders and prophets throughout history. It was reconfirmed and given in full, in entirety to Moshe, and passed on from teacher to student until the time of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, where permission was given to record it in writing. Those writings were hidden again for another 1,500 years, and were finally revealed around the year 1200. And from then on, it was published and publicized, and the masses on some level began to have some type of exposure and ability to learn the secrets of Kabbalah. In the 1500s, the great Rabbi Isaac Luria, one of the greatest Kabbalists that ever lived, he was as close as you can get to a prophet as can be. There are stories documenting he had divine communication. He knew secrets about people. He knew the future. He knew a lot of things. He comes and reveals and solidifies what we call modern Kabbalah in the 1500s. And from then on, all the Kabbalah that exists in the world, all of this mysticism that exists, whether it be any nation, whether it be from India or anywhere, any mystical concept that is true, has its source in this information given over by God to the prophets that we mentioned.